Let's make a Cherry Burl Bowl using this cored out blank. But how are we going to mount it to the lathe? Hi, I'm Kent and welcome to Turn a Wood Bowl. You may have seen me in a previous video turn this cored out center from this Cherry Burl blank. And today we're going to mount this to the lathe and we're going to turn it into a beautiful Cherry Burl bowl as well. Say that fast, Cherry Burl Bowl. The question is, how in the world do we mount this curved blank to the lathe? Well, it's not as hard as you might think, and I'm going to go ahead and put this on the lathe and we're going to get started.
Okay, so as you might have guessed, I'm going to mount this between centers. I'm going to use my 4-spur drive center, and we already have a mark from the first turning when we had this on the lathe earlier. So I can line that up, and we have this little nub which just gives us just enough material that we can see pretty much where the center is going to line up. And we're going to tighten up the tailstock, and look at that. The thing is turning pretty much true right off the bat. Now, the question is, how do we get enough space on there to mount this to a 4-jaw chuck? Well, what I'm going to do is I'm going to flatten out an area here where I can create a tenon. And we want to make this tenon as narrow as possible, because if I were to use a great big wide chuck here, we're going to remove a lot of material to get down to a final width. So instead I'm going to use my smallest 4-jaw chuck here. Now the only downside of that is it's going to give me it's going to be a little bit unstable on the lathe. So I need to be aware of the fact that I've got a small chuck and I'm not getting too aggressive with cuts when I'm making this bowl. So I'm going to take this little nub down because this nub will actually interfere with the 4-jaw chuck. So we need to get this material off of here. So I'm using my spindle detail gouge to kind of tighten that up. I can't quite get in there because it's such a short little nub. So what I'm going to need to do is I'm going to need to cut this off. So I'm just going to use my small thin pole saw, and once you get about halfway down, you're going to need to loosen up the tailstock because it's pinching it pretty good there. So just loosen that up a little bit and you can cut right through. Okay, so we get that out of the way and then we'll remount that back to the tailstock. And I'm going to go ahead and mark the size of my tenon that I need. And I'm going to go ahead and create the tenon and a shoulder. Now, this is burl, so there is really not a true supported grain direction. I'm using basic cuts here where I'm doing push cuts forward to make the tenon and the shoulder. But I need to keep in mind that with each rotation of this blank, the tool is coming into contact with grain basically coming at the cutting edge from every direction imaginable. It's not like a traditional side grain mounted bowl blank. Instead, it's this conglomeration. It's like a dough ball. I think about when you're a kid and you're making cookie dough and you lay out the cookie dough in a big blob. You imagine like a big blob of chocolate chip cookie dough that's laying on a cookie sheet, kind of spread out flat. And then you just very quickly and without any sense of organization, you just grab it by the edges and just wad it up into a big ball. Well, that's kind of how the grain pattern is in most burls. It is random and it's all over the place. So the way to combat that when you're turning a bowl is to make sure your tools are sharp at all times, because you want to cut through the material. You don't want a dull tool that is ripping material. Now the shoulder of this is actually going to become the foot of the bowl. So I'm going to go ahead and shape that a little bit right now. I want that to undercut just a little bit. And now I'm going to shape the exterior of this bowl. If we recall from the larger bowl that I turned that was the parent to this core. I'll put a link to that video up in the corner here if you guys want to check that out after this one. Well, if you recall, there were sections of that had big voids and internal bark enclosure, and there's some of that going on here as well. All right, I'm getting the shape. You can see I got that corner at the bottom, and I don't want that. I want that to curve out nicely, and I'm using a pull cut here to take that, and a shear scrape to take that corner down. Shear scrape is perfect for this because it shaves away just a small amount of material, and it can go right over the top of all those cracks and grooves. Want to take your time with the shear scrape, and you can see I can actually go back and forth with that because it is shaving away so small amount of material that it doesn't engage the bowl surface super aggressively, so you can actually go back and forth without any issues. You can see the curve taking shape here. I want this to be a nice fluid curve from the foot of the bowl all the way up to the rim. Of course, we're going through some big openings here, so you want to be very, very careful. Go very, very lightly. Oop, we got a catch. Yeah, we had a little section pop off there. But this is actually a part of the bark enclosure that I mentioned before. You can see where that popped out. The only thing holding it together on the backside was this bark, so there was no way that was going to stay in there. So we'll get right back in there and we shear scrape it again. Can't be afraid of it, but you do need to make sure that you're really steady and you don't move around too much with the bowl gouge. If you push that into the surface, you're going to get a catch. All right, so the exterior is shaped. We're going to go ahead and get this mounted to the 4-jaw chuck. I'm going to pop out that drive center. And you can see the size of that tenon is pretty small compared in proportion to the size of this. So I'm going to use the tailstock for added support, especially initially. Now I have all sorts of ridges and things I need to work against, and we also have this exterior bark, which is even harder than the other material. And because I'm getting these random areas that come in contact with the bowl gouge, and plus air, it's a little bit tricky. The strategy you want to implement here is to put down pressure into the tool rest. You do not want to push the bowl gouge into the turning, because what will happen is you'll push it into one of those low spots and then a high spot will smack it and you'll get beaten up. Instead, you push down on the tool rest and just guide your tool along a path so that it is allowed to slice away all of the high spots, as you can see here. Now I'm going to remove a bunch of this material on the inside the best I can while I can keep the tailstock in place, because it's going to give me a lot of stability. If I get a little catch, which is very easy with all those voids, there's a good chance I'm going to dislodge the tenon from the 4-jaw chuck. Take your time here. Again, the tool, you're going to feel how much material the tool can take away. Now, if this were a piece of green, wet sycamore, for instance, which is a lot less dense and has a very even grain pattern on it, it would turn like a bar of soap right here. At this moment, I could take a really deep pass and slice away these great big huge curly shavings of it, and at the same time not put much pressure on the tenon at all. However, this wood is dense, dry, and it has voids in it that are battering up against the tool, so I could easily get a catch here that could cause problems. So I'm making a lot thinner passes, and I'm noticing that the tool is slowing down a bit, so I'm going to go back and sharpen up the bevel and clean that up and clean up the cutting edge. It's just a couple passes on the CBN wheels and this gouge will be back in business. It'll cut a lot smoother. With hard, dense wood like this, you need to stop frequently and sharpen. But it doesn't take much, and we're pretty much done. There we go. There's times when I'll come back to the sharpening station because the gouge is starting to underperform and the CBN wheels will still be turning. That's when you know you have a dense, hard wood that you're turning. When you're turning or you're sharpening so frequently that the wheels on your sharpening station haven't even come to a complete stop yet between sharpenings. I'm starting to get a little bit more continuous material here. There's still some voids in there, but you can see how much more material I'm cutting versus when I first started doing this. I was basically cutting the tops of these mountain tops. It was creating quite a bit of vibration, but now it's becoming a bit smoother. Although, again, there still are quite a few voids in there. The same techniques as before. I'm going to work down this core, and then I'm going to get the tool rest out of the way because it's going to be in the way here. So we're going to take that out, and I'm going to establish my wall thickness. We need to determine how thick that wall is going to be. The cool thing about having a live edge like this, especially one with all these voids in it, is it allows you to see exactly where the tool is. Now what I'm doing is I'm looking down. This is my point of view. And I'm looking down and I'm looking at the exterior of the bowl, not the interior. I'm looking at the exterior and I'm making sure that the bevel of the bowl gouge is parallel with the exterior. That way I will have a nice even wall thickness as I proceed down inside this bowl. Clear away an area and then you go back and just rub the bevel until you pick up the cut. And you can feel where that area is a little bit thicker, and you just keep bringing it down. You kind of sneak up on that wall thickness as you go. You just take your time and remove material. I like to do little bits at a time. I'm only going an inch or two at a time, removing material, matching the wall thickness. And that way I'm not rushing and I know that I've got the walls exactly to the thickness that I want them to be. This is my 1/2 inch 55-degree bevel swept back bowl gouge. Basically working between the 1/2 inch and the 5/8 inch. The 5/8 inch is really good for roughing out and removing material. But at this point we are down to finishing cuts on the inside. So I like using the 1/2 inch gouge for this particular cut. Now we'll remove some more of that center mass. You can see the shavings coming off here are interesting because they're small little pellets. There's almost no curly shavings at all. And that's a good indication that you're turning burled wood because there's no continuous pattern of wood grains that will curl up into a shaving. To get those long shavings, you have to have really long, straight grain wood. So I'm going to remove the center mass now. We've got that. I left it out there a little long for a while, and we just need to take that down. And I'm back to my 5/8 inch 55-degree bevel swept back bowl gouge. And there's a dryness to this wood too. You can tell that this has been cut quite a while ago. Now I've got a little vibration there, and I just did it. I actually just moved the tenon, and it created a movement there. So this is a good example. If you get a little aggressive with this, it can slide it around, especially with the smaller tenon. So I'm going to loosen that and reposition it and tighten it, and hopefully it'll go right back into where it was. And it did. And there were some marks on the tenon where the jaws had clamped down on it, so I could line those up pretty easily and then clamp back down on that. But as soon as you see that it's not turning right, you want to check that tenon to make sure it's seated properly. very satisfying cutting these rows of circles. So we're going to take that center mass down. Now, at this point, especially with this open configuration of this burl, there's no way I'm going to go back to the top edge of that rim because it's flexing a lot. And there's no way for you to cut it smoothly. And what happens is because it's flexing, it's moving in and out, in and out. If you put the tool out towards the rim now, there's enough flexing going on that essentially that outer rim is going to smack the gouge, and you're holding it pretty steady, so it's like hitting a wall. So it's basically just going to tear off a section of that rim or just break the bowl in half if you try to go out to that rim. And when people talk about bowls blowing apart, it's usually when it occurs. When they have the bowl already turned down and the walls are relatively thin, and then they decide, oh, I want to go back up to that rim and make a little adjustment, maybe shape the rim a little bit differently or take off a little more material. But it is flexing and vibrating, and as soon as you introduce a solid, stable item like the bowl gouge to it, it's going to just shatter against that bowl gouge. So you don't really want to do that. So you can see right here, I'm not going to go back up to that rim. I'm just going to work this bottom section. I'm going to slowly take that down so it matches the rest of the wall thickness and then continues that fluid inside curve of the bowl. It's getting a little vibration with the 1/2 inch bowl gouge, so I'm going to switch back to my 5/8 inch bowl gouge. It's another thing to keep in mind. If you're getting vibration or chatter from your any tool, it probably has to do with a lack of support. You can see how I'm overreaching the tool rest here. There's about 3 or 4 inches, maybe 7 or 8 centimeters that are sticking out over the tool rest. Well, if I have a thinner bowl gouge, that steel is going to vibrate a little bit. If it vibrates and chatters, then it's going to leave tool marks on your surface, and you don't want that. Instead, you want to go with a little bit beefier bowl gouge. That's going to be a little bit more stable and is going to give you a nice, clean, smooth cut without any vibration. So I'm going back a little bit and picking up this cut. You can see how the cut goes from almost nothing to a little bit deeper and a little bit deeper. And that's so we can sneak up on that wall thickness. It's still a little thick in the bottom, which is what I want at this point. And I'll slowly bring this down to the ideal thickness. See, it's almost nothing there, and it gets a little bit deeper and a little bit deeper. And that's how you sneak up on that ideal wall thickness. It's up pretty high, but it's such a light cut that I'm making that I can get away with it. You just want to be really careful when you get up high like that. I'm going to bring the tool rest in a little bit. Actually, I'm going to switch over to my inside curve tool rest. That's going to give me a little bit closer contact or closer support for the bowl gouge right up against that surface. There we go. You can see how that's much closer. It's only about 1 inch or so extending over the tool rest at this point, where I was 3 inches over before. Again, you can see those shavings coming off almost as like little pellets. There's hardly any curling going on. It's such a tight, just a wound up grain inside burl, which is super neat. And this is black cherry, which black cherry is just a fantastic wood in general to turn. And even as a burl, it's still really nice for turning. Ah, that's looking so cool. It's a little high in the center still. And again, that's what you want. You don't want to don't try to make this in one cut. Just take your time and stop frequently and check the wall thickness, and then just gradually sneak up to it until you get it to right where you want it to be. You want that inside of the bowl to be slightly concave or match the curve of the exterior. All right, that's looking really good. Now, whenever you do a live edge bowl like this, you're always going to have some sort of tool marks right on the rim of the bowl. So you want to take your time. I'm using the side of the pad of the sander here to take out those tool marks. I'm using 120 grit sandpaper right now, and I'm taking my time and just removing any kind of tool marks. It's very common for them to be light tool marks there. You just take your time and remove them now, so then when you move through the finer grits, which 180 will be next, and then 240, and then 320, when you work through all of those grits, you'll have a nice smooth surface. Now, I've just done the 120 right now. I've dusted this off and I'm applying shellac. Now, shellac is going to act as a sealer and almost as an adhesive. It's going to hold some of this loose bark together. I've gone through and also picked out some of the very loose bark that's going to fall out anyway. Now, this shellac is not being used as the final finish. This is basically a pre-finish, if you will. It's going to bind the surface together nicely, and it's going to harden it or make it easier for me to sand it. So you can think of this as kind of like a sanding sealer. I will continue sanding through the different grits all the way up to 320 after this is dried really well. And it's also going to be the precursor for the lacquer. This is going to help make the surface really smooth and not as porous as it would be without the shellac. I'm going to leave the lathe on for a little bit and let the turning help dry this material and at least dry it evenly. All right, now with the dry, I'm going to come back and go through my grits, and I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to work the edges, I'm going to work through the center, and I'm going to do the interior and exterior all the way up to 320 grit like I mentioned. All right, it's looking really good. I need to take the tenon and the shoulder down to shape the foot, and then we'll apply the final finish. Now, with these burls, and whenever I have a really cool, intricate grain pattern like that, I love doing a shiny finish. And lacquer is a shiny, wonderful finish to use for a piece like this. This really is not designed to be used as a food or a food safe bowl, and lacquer technically once it's cured is food safe, but I don't like using lacquer because if it flakes off and things like that, it could be an issue. So, but I do like it for showier pieces like this, and this should look really nice. Now, in the previous Cherry Burl Bowl, or the parent to this one, the larger bowl, I used a spray system that I use frequently for larger pieces, and or if I'm doing a bunch of different lacquered pieces that need to be sprayed at once. But for this one, I'm going to actually just use canned lacquer, and we'll see how that turns out. So I'm going to remove this tenon and take this down using my spindle detail gouge to get in there and take this nub down. This is a relatively small foot, which is also very indicative of a decorative piece. Like, this is going to look great sitting on a counter or on a shelf, just as a beautiful conversation piece. It's one of those pieces you just pick up and just stare at it for a while, every once in a while. I love picking these up and just spending some time looking at them. It's incredible. So I'm going to apply forward pressure and turn the lathe off, and that's going to cut right through those final grains there. And then I'll sand the bottom of this, and then we'll get that sprayed. Got a little bit of torn fiber. You want to be careful with that. But again, this is burl, so it can do all sorts of crazy things. I'm using the chuck with the jam chuck in it and this sanding pad as a support system to sand that, and also to go ahead and sign the bottom of this. So now what I'm going to do, I'm using canned lacquer. I'll put a link to this in the description below this video, as well with all of the other tools and everything I've used on this video, so you want to check that out. And if you also want to ever see anything that I've used, go to my website and go to recommended gear up at the top of the website, turnawoodbowl.com, recommended gear at the top, and there'll be links to everything that I use. So what I'm doing is I'm applying light coats, light thin coats, and you want to work one area, work quickly, and then just let it sit. One coat should almost look like it's doing very little. You do not want to apply this thick, and you want to slowly build it up. And as it builds up, it's going to become more glossy. Look at that. Wow, look at the patterns coming out. Oh, it's absolutely gorgeous. You want to make sure you get into that bark as well. Look at that. Look at these little bird's eye patterns in there. That bark enclosure. Oh, absolutely gorgeous. It's amazing that this can actually stay together on the lathe. Look at that pattern. Absolutely gorgeous. Very, very pleased with this.
So here is the final piece. Look at that. Isn't that absolutely gorgeous? The randomness and the organic feel of burl is absolutely amazing. And then the black cherry on top of that makes it even that much better. But the fact that we salvaged this or used the inner core of a larger blank is even better, because this could have easily gone to waste, and that would be a shame to have wasted this. Look at that shape. And overall, I'm really, really happy with this. Now, what I shared with you on this one is that you can actually just use a rattle can, a lacquer, and get a really nice finish. Now, I typically go to my spray system when I have a larger project, or if I want to do a bunch of different projects all at once. It's a little bit more efficient way of spraying lacquer, and that might be a little bit too much for what you want to do. Now, if you want to learn more about how I set up my lacquer spray system, I've got an article on my website over at turnawoodbowl.com. You want to check that out because it's pretty detailed, but it's very simple to set up. But again, if you have a smaller piece like this, you can get away with the simple spray can of lacquer and get a really nice finish. Just remember that lacquer needs to build up in really light, thin coats. We don't want to put it on really thick because it will run. But if you put a thin coat on and wait just a few minutes, because it dries really quick, and apply another thin coat and apply another thin coat, what you're doing is you're filling in all those little crevices, and you're making the surface smoother and smoother and smoother. And the smoother it gets, the more reflectivity it gets, and that's when it becomes shiny. You're basically filling in all those little crevices to create a smooth, smooth surface. So if you're looking for a shiny surface on a bowl, lacquer is the way to go. And remember, I had the undercoat of shellac in there, and that undercoat of shellac really helps make that surface smooth initially. If you spray lacquer on raw wood, it's going to absorb into it, and it's going to take a while to fill all those little grooves. So putting shellac down first and then sanding it helps really develop a relatively smooth surface initially before you start spraying the lacquer. So just keep that in mind. Now, if you like this video, do me a favor and click that like button. I greatly appreciate you doing that. Thank you so much. Check out my website, turnawoodbowl.com. I have an article just on spraying lacquer with a air compressor system. You can check that out. Plus, I've got everything else you're going to need to know about turning wood bowls, including online courses that have lifetime access when you purchase them. So you might want to check out my website, turnawoodbowl.com. All right, guys, as always, thank you so much for watching. And until next time, happy turning.